Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 2, Constitutional History, and it's Lesson 5 about the tax rebellion that took place in the colonies prior to the American Revolution. In this lesson, you'll learn about the stamp tax, about the colonial reaction to that tax, about the tea tax that followed, and the colonial protests in response to it, and the British crackdown that came thereafter. To understand what happened in these historical events, we have to remind ourselves of a principle learned in the last lesson, the idea of salutary neglect, which was the failure of the British government to actively be involved in the governance of day-to-day life in the colonies, allowing them to make their own laws, choose their own leaders, etc. But most importantly to the story told in this lesson, it's a salutary neglect refers to the failure of that central government back in London to collect taxes from the colonists here in America. Salutary neglect came to an end during the 1760s and 1770s, after a couple hundred years of being in place. Now, why did it change? Why did the government in London start to assert more authority over the colonies? Why did it start trying to get taxes out of them? The answer to that can be found in the colonial empires of the 18th century. The European powers had colonies spread all over the world, and they ended up fighting each other over them. In particular, two coalitions of European countries led by England on one hand and France on the other, fought all over the world for their colonies. And that battle that they had all over the world, which took place from 1754 to 1763, is known in world history as the 7 Years' War. Now, it could have legitimately been called the First World War, because it was fought all over the world. But the part of it that was fought here in North America isn't even known as the 7 Years' War for us. Instead, in American history, it's known as the French and Indian War. It's just that part of the 7 Years' War that was fought here in America. Now, the part fought here in America was fought here because the British colonists settled along the Atlantic coast, while French settlers went to the interior along the Mississippi River Valley and Ohio River Valley, went in through Canada. And they met each other on the frontier, and there was fighting that took place. Now, the French were allied with the Indians, the Native Americans, and so that's why it's called the French and Indian War in our history, because the colonists in the British colonies were obviously on the side of their mother country in this war, fighting against the French and the Indians. Well, as part of fighting this war, the government back in England sent regular British troops for the first time to come and live here in the American colonies to defend them against the French who might be trying to take them over. When the war eventually came to an end, the Parliament back in England decided that, well, if we had sent those soldiers to America to protect those colonists from the French, and it was very expensive to do so, maybe those colonists should help pay for those soldiers. Now, that makes very good sense from their point of view. They sent the troops need to be paid for, the troops protected people, the people that were protected should have to help pay. So they then tried to impose a series of taxes to get the colonists to pay. But remember, the colonists had not paid taxes for hundreds of years while they've been here. Literally hundreds of years. French settlers, English immigrants and settlers had been here without having to pay taxes. And now suddenly the government's asking them for it. And the government asked in a particularly stupid way. Now I say stupid just because the way that they chose to impose a tax was very difficult to deal with. It was something called the stamp tax under the Stamp Act of 1765. Essentially, any paper goods that you bought, such as a newspaper or even a deck of cards, you would have to get a special stamp on each sheet of that paper showing that you'd paid a tax on it. A very unwieldy tax. But it wasn't just that it was an annoying way to be taxed that caused the colonists to reject this particular tax scheme and oppose it, but it was also a greater belief about the political implications of it. Now, it got them very upset. You can see this nasty little stamp that they made themselves showing their opinion of the stamp tax. But their opposition to it had a sound philosophical base. And that sound philosophical base can be found in the writings of John Locke. Please remember John Locke from earlier in this course. He was the English philosopher who theorized about the state of nature and how we'd have a great desire to protect our property from being stolen in the state of nature, so we would enter into society and create a government to protect our stuff. Well, with that being his basic point of view, you have to realize that if you create a government to protect your stuff, the last thing you want that government to do is to come take your stuff from you. Now, this creates a problem, though, because the government needs stuff to do its job. They're supposed to provide an army to protect you from outsiders, a police force to protect you from thieves, things like that. But that takes resources. Where's the government going to get the resources from if it can't get stuff, money, or other resources from its citizens to pay for these things? Well, the solution to that quandary, as John Locke said, they can't take your property from you, but you can consent to give it to them. And as he says in this quote on the screen, you can do it through the consent of the majority, either by yourself or through your representatives. But if the government ever claims that it has the power to levy taxes on a people by its own authority and without the consent of the people, then that invades a fundamental law upon which the society was created, that a person's property belongs to themselves. And therefore, it makes that tax invalid. So now think about what Locke's really saying here. The government can only tax you with your consent, and you give your consent by electing people who then vote on the tax and impose it upon you. In that way, you've participated in the process of choosing to be taxed. If, on the other hand, you are not allowed to have representatives in government, and the government taxes you, that tax is illegitimate. Well, many of the colonists looked at this situation and, like colonial politician James Otis said, taxation without representation is tyranny. And they were not represented in the parliament that was imposing this tax. None of the colonies were. Not just the colonies here in America, not the British colonies in India or Jamaica or South Africa or any other place in the world. They were not represented in parliament either. Now, you might think the easy solution to this problem is to just give the colonies representation. Then this Lockean argument of no taxation without representation doesn't work anymore, and they philosophically then have to pay their taxes. But the Parliament back in England was not going to do that. They had colonies spread all over the planet, with literally millions of people living in those colonies. If they gave those people fair representation, allowed them to elect people, and send them to England to meet in the Parliament, there'd end up being more people from the colonies in the Parliament than there would be from the homeland. So rather than laws being passed where the homeland bosses the colonies around, instead the colonial representatives would pass laws to boss the home country around. There was no way the home country was going to allow that to happen. So they said no representation, and the colonists said, therefore you can't tax us. And this conflict was severe enough that members of the government of 9 of the different colonies, of the 13 colonies here in North America established by England, representatives from 9 of those colonies got together for what they called the STAMPACT Congress. Now, it wasn't all 13 colonies, it was just 9, but this is still a dramatically important event because this is the beginning of those 13 colonies cooperating together. And they're cooperating together because they see a common enemy. The common enemy is this government in England that's no longer leaving them in salutary neglect, but is trying to impose what they view as invalid taxes upon them because they're not represented in Parliament. Now, prior to this, these colonies really thought of themselves as separate entities. Someone in Massachusetts thought they had no more in common with the colonists in Georgia than they had with colonists in Jamaica or South Africa or India or in Hong Kong or wherever it was. Wherever there were British colonists at, they were virtually the same. It was only when this stamp tax was imposed and other taxes at the same time to pay for the troops that had come to fight in the French and Indian War here in America and therefore it was a tax only on these colonies here in America, that these colonies in America began to see themselves as having something in common. And that thing that they had in common was the government back home in England treating them badly, trying to illegitimately tax them. So 9 of them got together and started talking about this, and this is the beginning of them becoming united in their efforts to fight back against what the government in England was doing to them incorrectly. Well, the government in England decided, okay, the stamp tax is a bad idea, and they got rid of it. And they instead imposed a tax on tea. Now, they thought this was a great solution because back in the 1760s, 1770s, tea was the drug of choice for the colonists. Now, I literally mean that. Tea is a drug. It contains addictive, stimulating substances in it, like other drugs. The people in the colonies drank lots and lots of tea. They felt that they needed to get up in the morning and have their cup of tea. So by taxing the tea, the idea was, well, they have to have their tea, they'll pay for it. And there was a great mechanism for it. As part of this law for the tea tax, the government in England created a monopoly for a particular company to sell all the tea that would be sold in the colonies. And that company was owned by the government. So the company would come in, sell the tea, collect a tax, pay it to the government, and the government would be happy, and the colonists were just going to keep buying their tea, they thought. Well, the colonists didn't see it the same way. They were outraged by the tea tax, to where, as shown in this picture from the time, below the Tree of Liberty, they were tarring and feathering a tax collector. They started smuggling in tea and other goods that were prohibited. They tried to work their way around the situation. And when someone got caught, they would use the jury system to let that person go. So they were actively fighting against enforcement of this law. Their outrage went so far to then lead them to participate in what became known historically as the Boston Tea Party, where some of these people who were upset about the tea tax went onto a ship in Boston Harbor full of this tea that they were supposed to be paying a tax on but weren't. And they threw it overboard into the harbor and destroyed it. This made the British government irate. They were supposed to be getting taxes from that tea. And they owned the tea. The company that owned it was owned by the government. So not only did they lose the taxes, but they lost the product itself, which was valuable. So the British Parliament got furious. Now, please notice how this is getting worse and worse. The British Parliament decides to legitimately, from their point of view, collect a tax to help pay for soldiers. The colonists say, no, that's illegitimate, we're not going to pay it. So the Parliament rescinds it and replaces it with a different tax, and then the colonists actively rebel against it with things like the Boston Tea Party. So the Boston Port Act. The blockade of Boston Harbor means that British warships came in and surrounded the entrance to the harbor and wouldn't let anyone in or out, and said they would not have any business going out. The most busy harbor in North America at the time. They would not let anybody go in and out for trade until the tea that had been destroyed was paid for. So, as I explained a moment ago, these disagreements led to escalating hostilities between the government back in England and the colonies here in America. Escalating hostilities that led to so much distrust and anger and conflict that eventually the differences became irreconcilable and the American Revolution resulted. Now let's review what we learned. Why were colonial taxes imposed after not having been imposed for a couple hundred years? Was it to improve transportation, or pay for frontier exploration, or to pay for British troops that were now being housed here, or to encourage manufacturing? The correct answer is to pay for British troops. Now remember, from the point of view of the Parliament, this was a wise thing to do. They needed troops here to protect them, and they should be paid for by the people living there. But that's not how the colonists saw it. Why were the colonial taxes opposed that were put in place to pay for these troops? Because of no representation in Parliament, inadequate services being provided by the government, the fact that taxes in England were actually lower, or that the taxes were unfair for farmers. Well, the philosophical reason they gave for opposing the taxes was that they had no representation in Parliament, and therefore John Locke had taught them it was an illegitimate tax if they were not represented. Next question, what tax replaced the stamp tax? Was it a tax on tea, or on leather, or on tobacco, or on lumber? As you learned, it was a tax on tea, which they thought was a great idea, but turned out not to be. The Boston blockade was in response to what event? Was it a Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, Boston Marathon, or the Battle of Boston? It was, of course, the famous Boston Tea Party. And what did the Intolerable Acts do? Or I should say, what did they not do? Did they not require quartering of soldiers? Did they not require the closing of Boston Harbor? Did they not require stopping of town meetings? Or did they not require the releasing of prisoners? Well, they did the first three things, which really angered the colonists. The correct answer is the Intolerable Acts did not require the releasing of prisoners. All right, that does it for this lesson 5 of Unit 2. Our next lesson, lesson 6 of Unit 2, will be about independence.